Okay, I think the numbers have slowed down a little bit. So, being aware of the time, I want to get started. So, welcome everyone to our webinar on Less Perfect, More Powerful Self-Compassion Tools for Lawyers to Reduce Perfectionism, Fear of Failure, and Imposter Feelings. I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. Tracy Myers, momentarily. I'm Amy Levine, Director of Programs and Volunteers. I'm going to be your host for today. And before we begin, I want to take a moment to remind everyone about the confidential and free services that Lawyers Concern for Lawyers offers to support the well-being of the legal community. And these include one-on-one consultations with licensed clinicians for mental health and substance use concerns, peer support groups, educational programs, and also one-on-one consultations with our law practice advisor on firm management and professionalism. A few housekeeping notes. We love questions. Please feel free to submit those questions using the chat feature, and we'll answer those at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Tracy Myers. Dr. Tracy Myers is a licensed clinician, clinical psychologist with over 25 years of experience in neuropsychology assessment and psychotherapy. Before joining LCL in 2020, she spent 17 years with the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, serving as a clinical neuropsychologist and later as the director of behavioral intervention services. She's also a certified yoga therapist, advanced yoga teacher, and mindfulness instructor, and has written extensively on integrative medicine and positive behavioral support treatment. She is the author of Yin Yoga Therapy and Mental Health, and she serves on the board of Mindfulness in Law Society, promoting well-being in the legal profession. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Myers.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I know this is like a big topic. And as always, when I do presentations, my goal is to not provide an exhaustive overview of the literature and research, but really to think about practical, pragmatic tools that you can use when you're struggling with any of the topics we're going to be talking about today, which for many lawyers is relevant. And so you're in good company if you've struggled with any of the issues we're going to talk about today around perfectionism, imposter syndrome, or fear of failure. So I'm going to begin and share my slides. All right. So as Amy already shared, and many of you are aware of what we offer here at LCL in terms of individual consultations, recovery groups, and other kinds of support groups, and then our career and practice management opportunities. And we find that many lawyers take advantage of all of these services, which we love. So feel free, if you've explored some pieces of LCL to check out the other services that we provide. And just to name a few of the different things that we focus on, which have a lot of overlap with what we're talking about today, particularly around stress and anxiety, coping behaviors, etc. All right, so today we're going to talk about perfectionism, fear of failure, imposter feelings, which all relate to one another, and then specifically how it can impact lawyers' decision making, ethical practices, and mental health. We're going to talk about self-compassion and some cognitive behavioral techniques that can help when you are encountering these self-critical thoughts and how to work with that in a more constructive way. So this is kind of the pragmatic part of the presentation today. What are some actual skills that I can apply to reduce some of the distress that I may be feeling? And then we'll do at least two, depending on our time, a couple of practices to look at self-compassion and nervous system regulation around work, and especially when we're activated by some of the self-critical thoughts. So I like this quote. It kind of describes, I think, what so many lawyers struggle with. No matter how hard I work, for some reason it never feels good enough. I tend to overachieve and stretch myself thin. I'll work long hours, take on too many projects at once, or absorb a heavier workload than I can realistically handle, and never admit that I need help with a project or task. I mean, I'm wondering how many of you can relate to that. I can relate to that as well, not even as a lawyer, but as a professional. But there's some really important things in here, right? Like never feels good enough, overachieving, working long hours, difficulty admitting help, right? So some of these really ongoing challenges when we're struggling with imposter syndrome. So, imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon is actually not a psychological diagnosis at all. We hear this a lot, and people will often talk about it like it's a clinical diagnosis. It's not. In 1978, two psychologists talked about it as a phoniness in people who believe they are not intelligent, capable, or creative despite evidence of high achievement. I think we would use slightly different terminology now, but really, essentially, we're talking about this fear of rejection and failure, coupled with very high expectations, including perfectionism. And it's not a diagnosis; it's more of an internal phenomenon. What's happening inside of us in terms of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. And interestingly, it used to be that it was for people that were really high achieving. That was the idea. Imposter phenomenon would happen only to those that were in high power positions. But the truth is, it's not. It can affect anyone. And so it's so pervasive across different disciplines, across whether you're a legal assistant or whether you're a judge, right? It can come up in multiple settings. And there's a range, right? So sometimes it can just be a slight feeling of inadequacy, right? We're talking to somebody and we feel like, oh, they know much more than I do, to very strong feelings of failure or fraud or a deep-seated anxiety that you'll be exposed as not knowing anything, right? So as we go through this presentation today, you may notice, yourself getting activated or feeling, different emotions. And the topic of self-compassion, I'm going to interweave, but please try to bring self-compassion to the parts of you that actually, struggle with this, because this is hard. And most of us struggle with feelings of imperfection and that, we don't measure up compared to our peers. So this is just, a very, normal feeling, and we're going to talk about some strategies. But just to bring in self-compassion right away when you start to see characteristics that may match what you've been experiencing. So, as always, I love to do sometimes to search and see what are some good descriptions of imposter syndrome. And so I'm going to share a couple with you so that hopefully this will be helpful. And you can feel that you're in good company and not alone in your experience.
Even after writing 11 books and winning several prestigious awards, Maya Angelou couldn't escape the nagging doubt that she hadn't really earned her accomplishments. Albert Einstein experienced something similar. He described himself as an involuntary swindler whose work didn't deserve as much attention as it had received. Accomplishments at the level of Angelou's or Einstein's are rare, but their feeling of fraudulence is extremely common. Why can't so many of us shake feelings that we haven't earned our accomplishments, or that our ideas and skills aren't worthy of others' attention? Psychologist Pauline Rose Clance was the first to study this unwarranted sense of insecurity. In her work as a therapist, she noticed many of her undergraduate patients shared a concern. Though they had high grades, they didn't believe they deserved their spots at the university. Some even believed their acceptance had been an admissions error. While Clance knew these fears were unfounded, she could also remember feeling the exact same way in graduate school. She and her patients experienced something that goes by a number of names: imposter phenomenon, imposter experience, and imposter syndrome. Together with colleague Suzanne Imes, Clance first studied imposterism in female college students and faculty. Their work established pervasive feelings of fraudulence in this group. Since that first study, the same thing has been established across gender, race, age, and a huge range of occupations, though it may be more prevalent and disproportionately affect the experiences of underrepresented or disadvantaged groups. To call it a syndrome is to downplay how universal it is. It's not a disease or an abnormality. and it isn't necessarily tied to depression, anxiety, or self esteem. Where do these feelings of fraudulence come from? People who are highly skilled or accomplished tend to think others are just as skilled. This can spiral into feelings that they don't deserve accolades and opportunities over other people. And as Angelo and Einstein experienced, there's often no threshold of accomplishment that puts these feelings to rest. Feelings of imposterism aren't restricted to highly skilled individuals either. Everyone is susceptible to a phenomenon known as pluralistic ignorance, where we each doubt ourselves privately, but believe we're alone in thinking that way because no one else voices their doubts. Since it's tough to really know how hard our peers work, how difficult they find certain tasks, or how much they doubt themselves, there's no easy way to dismiss feelings that we're less capable than the people around us. Intense feelings of imposterism can prevent people from sharing their great ideas or applying for jobs and programs where they'd excel. At least so far, the most surefire way to combat imposter syndrome is to talk about it. Many people suffering from imposter syndrome are afraid that if they ask about their performance, their fears will be confirmed. And even when they receive positive feedback, it often fails to ease feelings of fraudulence. But on the other hand, hearing that an advisor or mentor has experienced feelings of imposterism can help relieve those feelings. The same goes for peers. Even simply finding out there's a term for these feelings can be an incredible relief. Once you're aware of the phenomenon, you can combat your own imposter syndrome by collecting and revisiting positive feedback. One scientist who kept blaming herself for problems in her lab started to document the causes every time something went wrong. Eventually, she realized most of the problems came from equipment failure and came to recognize her own competence. We may never be able to banish these feelings entirely, but we can have open conversations about academic or professional challenges. With increasing awareness of how common these experiences are, perhaps we can feel freer to be frank about our feelings and build confidence in some simple truths. You have talent, you are capable, and you belong. Everyone can use a little extra kick.
All right. Yeah, so hopefully when you see Albert Einstein and Maya Angelou, you start to feel like you're in good company. And I really appreciate sort of that matter of fact understanding. Like so many things, when we're able to understand, name what the situation is, imposter phenomenon, it can decrease some of the suffering and feeling of being alone. So we're going to continue to talk about some strategies in a moment. So specifically for lawyers, think about, why lawyers are more susceptible. As the first bullet indicates, lawyers are susceptible. And, particularly new lawyers, right? Law students and new lawyers, because there's this sense of having to prove themselves. So already that can set up this imposter phenomenon, right? If you have to prove yourself, you have to know what you're talking about. You're going to have to look or be perfect. And then we also have the other end of the spectrum with senior lawyers that have to preserve this illusion of being knowledgeable, knowing exactly what to do, a flawless practitioner who doesn't make mistakes. And so you can see the setup, right? Either as a beginning lawyer or as a senior lawyer, where there isn't a lot of opportunity to share or to even check into one's own internal process around imposter syndrome or phenomenon. And then this ongoing, comparisons, criticism, fear of rejection, and then difficulty asking for help. These are all, sort of the fuel for why the imposter phenomenon can occur, particularly for lawyers. And then when people get feedback, and we saw this in the video, sometimes even calling attention to somebody's performance or getting a positive review can increase the imposter phenomenon. Like, oh, this if they really knew how I, did X, Y, and Z, or I've hidden these mistakes and people don't know it. And then finally, failure, even after many, many successes, can create a real existential crisis and sometimes exacerbate feelings of being a fraud or or an imposter. So lawyers are at risk, right? And so just again starting with that assumption so that it doesn't come into play further down the line, which we're going to talk about what can happen. So I kind of like this idea that we have specific personalities that make us more prone to imposter syndrome. Now, number one, and we're going to spend time with this perfectionistic piece because we've tied this in so much, but perfectionists are much more at risk for imposter syndrome because it's impossible to be perfect, right? And so that feeling of failure um, for lawyers is so strong when they haven't been able to get to that level that they want to. And this can happen during law school, of course, but also, in early career and even late career. Now, you could take some people that are natural geniuses that easily learn so that when there's a challenge to that, it's so distressing, right? Because things have come relatively easy. And again, I think about college students and then moving into law school, how that challenge, sometimes the first poor grade can be devastating because people are so used to doing well. Um, and then we've got a lot of rugged people, right? A lot of rugged individualist lawyers types that feel like they should be able to do it by themselves and they don't want to ask for help. It's not even an option. Experts, people that really want to learn everything, and then they feel like a failure if they've missed something. And then finally, our superhero role, expected to take every challenge on and should be doing even more. So check inside yourself as you've looked at these different categories now. And we have more than one, of course, right? So lawyers often have multiple personality styles that can feed into this perfectionistic imposter syndrome. So for you, just kind of looking through and maybe naming to yourself which one, two, or three do you tend to struggle with. And why it's important is you can actually start to see this coming up day to day and recognize it. And once we're able to recognize some of these tendencies, thoughts, and behaviors, then we have points of intervention. So we're going to spend some time now talking about perfectionists, right? Which is no surprise given the title today, and how perfectionism specifically can fuel imposter syndrome. And then take this, again, in for yourself without judgment, but with curiosity. What happens for you? What happens for you when you have standards that are unrealistic, right? Perfectionists, people that struggle with perfectionism often have like a cognitive, I call it like a cognitive challenge, a difficulty with flexibility. And things become all or nothing. I either failed or I succeeded. I either won the case or I didn't. Now, there are some things that are all or nothing, but so often when we set things up for that all or nothing and we fail, it becomes devastating. Now, this is a tricky one too, self-worth tied to performance. It's really hard to not tie it into performance in a lot of ways. So we're talking about gradations, right? So it may be, of course, that when we do well, we feel good about ourselves. When we don't do well on the job, we may not feel as good. So we're talking about how extreme does this get? How devastating does it get if there's a misstep or a loss, right? And so we're not talking about all or nothing here, but more about how much does it impact your self-esteem and how you feel about yourself. Now, this is true for so many of us. We often focus on what went wrong rather than what went right. Think about your last performance review and how often the couple of comments at the end, like what Tracy could work on, right? That sticks in our head so much more than like all the things that we did well. And our brains are literally wired this way, right? We have a negativity bias, which means that our brains are going to focus and take in the negative information. It's actually a survival instinct. We want to know what could get us in trouble, what is crucial for our survival. But what happens is then we tend to focus or over focus on the flaws, mistakes, and negative feedback. And we misproportion really the successes, right? So that when in our own minds, our performance appraisal said we were terrible and we have all these areas to work on versus the reality of lots of successes. So we are partially wired this way. And for lawyers, there's so much focus on winning and comparisons so that it becomes, also an environmental exposure as well as a developmental evolutionary reason why we focus on the negative. Social comparison and the fear of exposure for so many lawyers, making mistakes or being seen as making a mistake is just so distressing, right? And so this desire to hide imperfections, like the video was showing, how each person is hiding their imperfections so nobody recognizes that we're all struggling with this. And what we see with lawyers, and this happens often with clients I'm working with, there can be an avoidance or a procrastination, because if we put so much pressure on ourselves to make sure that we get it right, do it perfectly, that sometimes that can be overwhelming and create overwhelming anxiety in our nervous system. And so when that happens, we can tend to avoid. When we avoid doing a task, it's because it often is something that matters a lot to us, but we're afraid of failing. And so in the short run, avoidance can decrease anxiety. Okay, if I don't do it now, I'll put it off. Tomorrow I'll feel better. But what happens is, of course, it can increase feelings of fraudulence, increase fear and anxiety. So avoidance and procrastination, which we have other topics, you've probably heard some of these topics, or you can see on our website, we've done webinars around avoidance and procrastination. It is deeply tied into our fears. We don't avoid things that we don't care about. We often avoid things that we deeply care about, but we are worried about doing them poorly or not good enough. And then can get stuck into a validation seeking, right? Where like even reassurance or accolades can like not even touch us, or maybe so briefly, but then it sets up a desire to need that over and over, because internally we're struggling so much with focusing on the negative. So you can see how perfectionism can fuel and increase imposter syndrome. And again, to think about imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon as natural, part of being human, right? But when we add in this perfectionism and unrealistic expectations for ourselves, how that can really create so much more distress and then lead to more mental health challenges. So imposter phenomenon, remember, not a diagnosis, doesn't mean you necessarily have to rush out to therapy to fix it, but it can create more distress. So we're going to talk to Brene Brown now. We're not going to talk to her, but we're going to watch her talk to Oprah. Brene is awesome. Yeah, I'm sure many of you are familiar with her, but she talks about perfectionism and so many other topics in this very accessible way. And I'm really trying to set the stage, as you hear, to really feel like you are not alone. You are in good company with Brene and Oprah and Maya. And I'm just using first names because just to make it so familiar for us. You're not alone in struggling with this. So let's see what Brene and Oprah come up with. And then we'll continue with some strategies.
Talk about some of the most common examples of armor. You were talking about the armor that we put on to protect ourselves.
Yeah, I think the big three are perfectionism, numbing, foreboding joy. And there's also cynicism, cool, and being critical. So let's look at them. Perfectionism. How many of you struggle with perfectionism a little bit? Okay, so my favorite story is that someone sent me an email one time that said, hey, I know you have a book on shame, not so interested in that, but if you ever write on perfectionism, I can't wait. So here's the secret. When perfectionism is driving, shame is always riding shotgun. And fear is the annoying backseat driver.
Say it again.
When perfectionism is driving, shame is always riding shotgun. We struggle with perfectionism in areas where we feel most vulnerable to shame. Does that make sense? So we're all comfortable saying, yeah, I'm a little perfectionistic, which is code for like I do things really well. But I'm not comfortable saying I have shame. But perfectionism, what is that? I call it the 20-ton shield. Here's what perfectionism really is. It's a way of thinking that says this: if I look perfect, live perfect, work perfect, I can avoid or minimize criticism, blame, and ridicule.
Whoa, that's good.
All perfectionism is the 20-ton shield that we carry around, hoping that it'll keep us from being hurt. When in truth, what it does is it keeps us from being seen. And so we had a great talk about what's the difference between perfectionism.
Yes, because somebody on my staff had the nerve to tell me that I was a perfectionist. And I absolutely denied that. And you stood by me. Thank you very much. Because I'm not a perfectionist. I'm a person who strives for excellence and requires excellence. There is a difference, is there not?
There is a difference. Here's the difference. Because sometimes I'm a healthy striver.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm a perfectionist. It depends on if I've got a worthiness crunch going on. So healthy striving is internally focused. It's I want to do this and be the best I can be. Perfectionism is not about what I want. Perfectionism is exactly what will people think.
Yes.
So how many of you are driven by what will people think? So I'll give you a great example. So while we're taping these, my son's first day at school. And so, I'll be home tomorrow, right? It's not a big deal, but it's what will people think?
Is he in the first grade?
Second.
Second.
So he is monogrammed from toe to toe. His haircut, everything's laid out. His lunch will have some kind of vegetable fruit ratio that's perfect. Because I am struggling a little bit.
Because you're here with me and not.
And what will people think?
What will people think? They're going to think, there she is up there with Oprah.
Yeah. Talking about how to be a good parent.
How to be a good parent. Boots. Yes, and her fancy boots. Yeah.
Right. So I don't think so. The thing is, you can't ever do anything brave if you're wearing the straitjacket of what will people think.
Yeah. I love Renee. She just says it in such a straightforward way. Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit now more about this striving, versus perfectionism, because I love that distinction that she makes. So let's talk about healthy striving versus perfectionism. Because I would probably lose you all on this webinar if I said, like we can't strive, because lawyers, of course, are striving, right? And it's healthy to strive, right? This idea of being able to really have goals and be driven by your values that guide the goals, right? So let's look at these side by side. So perfectionism, driven by fear of mistakes and harsh self-judgment, versus healthy striving, driven by growth, competence, and purposeful goals. And I want to think about this as not necessarily black or white, right? That we're talking about a spectrum. Perfectionism standards are rigid, unrealistic, and tied to self-worth. And then the standards are ambitious but flexible and realistic. Perfectionism can lead to procrastination, overwork, indecision, and burnout, versus encourages learning, resilience, manageable effort, and recovery. Perfectionism focus on avoiding failure, errors seen as proof of inadequacy, versus focus on progress and adaptive problem solving, mistakes seen as feedback. And then this last piece, and this is what Brene was talking about, this external validation. So perfectionism is driven by this need for validation outside of oneself, and especially around how hard we're trying. And versus more of this internal motivation from what matters to us, what our values are, what our professional purpose is, what our, we call this like, work satisfaction, job satisfaction, meaning and purpose. And so if you are tending toward the left side of this, or you may notice at times you're striving in a healthy way and at times more perfectionistic. So think about this as a continuum and think about where, you may need to or want to start to shift this a little bit. So maybe on a couple of these, you feel really strong around, I can handle mistakes. That's okay. But that validation piece is really strong. And so we're going to try to look at where can you continue to move on your continuum toward more healthy striving. So the impact of imposter phenomenon and perfectionism can be low self-esteem and self-doubt, right? And when we have that, when we don't feel good about ourselves, it can impede our career growth, right? When we don't have that sense of that we deserve it, that we're worthy, that we're as good as other people, why are we going to be willing to put ourselves out there? We're not, right? We're not going to be willing to put ourselves out there to apply for a different position, to take on, a partner role, because we don't feel like we can actually handle it. So it can really hamper leadership, right? This idea that, how could I help other people when I feel like a fraud myself? The other piece is that it can really impact our cognitive flexibility. And cognitive flexibility allows us to think about other strategies. It includes reflecting on what doesn't work, like that video with the scientist who actually discovered that what wasn't working was the equipment, not her decision making. We can get very narrow and rigid in our thinking process, which makes it super hard to be innovative. Because there's just not room and our brains don't give us the room. So it narrows our lens of options, right? We start to feel like we don't have a lot of choices. And then the piece that we see, at the LCL is issues with mental health, right? Feeling more isolated, more stress and more anxiety and depression, right? And for lawyers who have been at this a long time, for many of you here that have been lawyers for years and years, the impact of that can be really significant. So we know it's not a clinical diagnosis, but we do know that it can impact how you feel about yourself, the decisions you make as a lawyer, and also sometimes your emotional and mental health. So we want to take it seriously, but also recognize that it's an ongoing process, right? That it's not suddenly that we're going to flip to all of the growth enhancing tasks and never go into the perfectionism task. And like Brene was sharing, people like being perfectionistic. It feels like a good quality. Oh, that's like it's like one of those questions when they ask you at a job interview, what's your weakness? And you say perfectionism, but you really think, but it is actually a strength. So I hope today that we can recognize that like it's not a weakness, but it can have implications, and that we can think about this as an area that we can shift toward more healthy, value-driven striving versus perfectionism. So, what are the tools? What are ways that we can start to bring self-compassion in to support our mental health and to support this movement from rigid or less open around making mistakes and fear of failure to more realistic and a more supportive way of viewing our struggles? So, we're going to start now talking about self-compassion. And so, some of you have probably heard me speak of this topic before. I'm super passionate about self-compassion because, as Brene said, and others have talked about, self-compassion is the antidote to shame. Self-compassion is the antidote to shame. And so much of perfectionism is rooted in shame, like Brene was saying, right? Driving in the passenger seat, right? So we can work on if we can work on some of the shame pieces, that can help reduce the need to be seen as perfect. So self-compassion is this, kind of very well-researched body of literature talking about these three components. And this goes back to Kristin Neff and Christopher Germer, who really have talked about and broken down self-compassion into different qualities, and then also from these qualities, some interventions that we can utilize. So Kristin Neff talks about three main qualities, which I'm going to share: mindfulness, kindness, and common humanity. So mindfulness helps us to first identify these painful feelings. We accept perfectionism, right? And so often we're used to being this way. But mindfulness helps us to recognize, oh, actually, this can be very painful when we feel this way. So instead of suppressing it or using it as like oh, this is a great thing that I'm a perfectionist, to be able to actually acknowledge, oh, this hurts when I feel this way, or when I feel criticized, or when I feel like I failed, I feel shame, right? So mindfulness helps us first just even acknowledge what the feeling is. When we acknowledge it, mindfulness helps us name it, right? And when we name it, it begins to turn us away from denial, avoidance, or more judgment, and it begins to turn us in toward, oh, how can I help this difficult feeling inside of me? And maybe it's getting help, but also how can I help myself? And this turns more towards self-kindness. We're going to talk about this specifically with perfectionism in a moment, but more generally, it's treating ourselves with more care and understanding rather than harsh judgments, right? So if I make a mistake, if I didn't get, something done on time, if someone sees that I'm struggling with something, to be able to see that as being human rather than there's something wrong with me. And then how do I soothe myself in the moment when I'm feeling really distressed? Even if I've tried to talk myself out of it, what can I do? And we're going to talk about that. And so essentially, when we're being kind to ourselves, we're trying to alleviate a feeling of distress in our system, which often happens as a result of the perfectionism and feelings of being an imposter. And then finally, this is so important. And that's why, normalizing it with Brene and some of our others, Michelle Obama has a beautiful piece. It was too long of a clip, but a beautiful piece on feeling like an imposter, right? So you see these amazing people that struggle with it and recognize you're not alone. The numbers are somewhere around 70%, probably even higher for lawyers, but across all people, all disciplines, about 70% of us struggle with imposter syndrome. So that's really high, right? And so we can be, we can be assured that other people are feeling just like us, right? And because of that, we're all worthy of compassion. So these are the three components of self-compassion. And interestingly, most people are much more compassionate toward other people than themselves. In fact, I've seen blank stares when I bring up this idea of self-compassion. I was working with a very high achieving person. And when I talked to her about, like, well, how do you soothe yourself when you're feeling distressed or you're feeling like you're not measuring up? And she looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. She's like, soothing? Like literally, it was perplexing because we don't often think about, oh, we deserve and we should and we need to soothe ourselves when we're feeling upset. And for women, this discrepancy of being more compassionate toward other people and not toward ourselves is really, really difficult. It's really part of gender norms. And so, I want to also put that out there too. It can be much harder based on our upbringing and also what society tells us that we should be. Um, but meeting our own needs, including care and kindness toward ourselves, actually helps us be more available and helps us to relate more to other people too. And so research shows self-compassion can reduce stress and burnout for a variety of professions, including lawyers. Self-compassion can reduce burnout, which is one of the potential problems when we have perfectionistic or imposter syndrome feelings on a chronic level. There's a self-compassion scale you can take. I tell this story often because it is a moment of I guess shame for me. Like when I took the scale, Kristen Neff came up with this self-compassion scale. It's on her website, selfcompassion.org. I had been teaching mindfulness for a while. And of course, parent, psychologist, wife, etc., etc. And I felt like, of course I have self-compassion. Well, I took this test and I was really low on the self-compassion scale. I was like, "Ooh," right? And I was surprised that I was surprised, right? And so it was this moment of like recognition of like, oh, actually, I'm not practicing what I'm preaching, which then could be more armor for making myself feel bad. But I tried to think about it as actually a potential value, a way to like, what could I do to actually improve this so that I was able to bring in more self-compassion, more inner kindness toward myself. So if you're curious, take the self-compassion scale, not as a way to judge yourself, but actually as a beginning of how can I treat myself with more kindness. So I always like to encourage getting some metrics on where you are. So self-compassion, when we bring it in, can change how we feel about ourselves and even start to soften some of that perfectionistic judgment that we've been living by. It helps us feel more connected and loving. And we can move from feeling alone. Again, think about that video I showed, the first video with each person sitting at their desk having imposter feelings, to feeling more interconnected with other people. And so our little poor young parts of ourselves that feel very, alone and struggling, we often can like help ourselves to feel more connected by bringing in self-compassion. Now, when we have perfectionistic standards and work ethics, it can feel very difficult to lean in towards self-compassion because it can feel like you're pitying yourself or it's going to undermine your motivation. It's like if I'm not hard on myself, then I'm going to fail. How many of you have already thought about that when I've talked about self-compassion today? Like, yeah, that sounds good, but I got to really, if I'm not hard on myself, forget it. I'm gonna just be incredibly lazy. Research shows that's not true, and that's why Neff's work is so revolutionary. She has shown through her research, and she was a perfectionist as well. If you ever look at her stuff, she talks about her own very high standards for herself and her very low self-compassion, how it actually can really get in the way. And so, the misgivings through the research are not true. The research shows that actually you can reduce shame, reduce anxiety, can even reduce suicidal ideation, the effects of trauma, and it can improve how you feel about yourself and how you feel about others. It can make you feel happy, like it actually can increase happiness and this resiliency. And so when you think about that healthy striving slide I shared a while ago, around resiliency, the ability to make mistakes and be okay with that and to use it as a learning opportunity. That's what we're talking about with resiliency. So self-compassion can really help with those um, tools needed to move from perfectionism to more value-based and goal-based healthy striving. It also helps interpersonally. Interestingly, when we can be more self-compassionate, when we relate to other people, we are more supportive. It's like we're not so separate, right? Because we're not trying to protect and hide behind some of our imperfections by, presenting ourselves in this positive way, right? We tend to then be able to understand other people's behavior in the same way that we're understanding our own. And so we're more forgiving, we can take more perspective, we're better leaders because we can see both sides and we can use ourselves as an example. I mean, when you listen to Brene Brown, why I like her so much, and people like her, Kristen Neff as well, they share their own stuff because they understand that, like, when they can share that, it helps us, and then we can help other people when we can share that. So when lawyers who are in leadership roles can share that they've struggled, they've made mistakes, they struggle with addiction, they've gone to therapy, can make a whole list of things, it makes such a difference for people working under them or with them, because it feels like we're all struggling, and we all can help each other in that way. So self-compassion can help you with better boundaries too. Some of the things that perfectionistic lifestyles often do are like creating an imbalance in work life. That very first slide about I'm working, way too many hours and not enough work-life balance, right? And so the research shows just 20 seconds a day of self-compassion can help. And we'll talk about a 20-second practice in a moment, but really the idea that when we can create a more inner warmth toward ourselves, it can help us even lean in toward what we need to do to make our work-life balance more effective. Okay, so now let's talk about some strategies to apply self-compassion to reducing imposter syndrome and some of the perfectionistic striving that we've been talking about today. So first of all, we're going to apply mindfulness. And mindfulness means recognizing, I think about mindfulness as shining the light of awareness, shining the light of awareness on our thinking, feeling, and behavior. Without judgment, without suppressing, it's just noticing, oh, this is what I'm doing. So one thing to be aware of, first of all, is that often people around us that seem very confident actually don't know as much as they appear to know. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias, and there was a research done by Dunning and Kruger in 1999, and they talked about how people are often overconfident of their skills, and that people that are more overconfident, that seem really confident, actually have less skills, and the people that seem less confident actually have more skills. And you can apply this to a variety of settings, but I have a daughter who got her driver's license last year. And when we started driving, she was so overconfident. It made me crazy. She's like, I got this. I know what to do. And I was like, I don't think she knows what to do, right? Really overconfident. So then it was Thanksgiving a year ago. We pull into this very crowded supermarket parking lot. Oh, my daughter was a mess. She didn't know where to yield. She started to drive on the wrong side of the road. Cars are backing up. I am like grabbing the wheel in horror. And I was like, oh yeah, she didn't know what she's doing at all. And so, this ability to, overcompensate or to look like you know more than you're doing. And so when we see people that are so confident, just remember, that doesn't necessarily translate it into real skills. And so, and the reverse is true too. People that are struggling with confidence often have, lots and lots of skills. They just know that they may not be perfect at it, right? So it's like people don't always know what they don't know, right? And so as we become more skilled and more seasoned, we actually may sometimes feel less confident because we understand how much we don't know at times. And then also just to not always have to be an expert. It's so hard because lawyers are asked to be experts, as are psychologists. But it's okay to say it depends or I don't know, and to feel the relief of not always having to know the answer or to be able to get the answer somewhere else. And I'd like to start to challenge yourself, because once we can start to recognize these perfectionistic standards, can you start to name that? Like, oh yeah, I can really feel this pull for approval, or, ooh, this felt so hard when I received that feedback, right? So we want to name it and acknowledge it and recognize that these are thoughts and they're not necessarily true, right? The second piece is bringing the self kindness in. How do we talk to ourselves? And the truth is, for most of us, our inner dialogue can be very negative. That's what I found out when I was doing the self compassion scale. It was like, oh my gosh, my inner dialogue, ooh, right? Like I wouldn't want anyone to see the thought bubbles happening in my brain. And some of it's happening so unconsciously, and I'm so used to it, I don't even notice it. And so we have to activate a little bit of our self kindness. It doesn't always come naturally to us. And so, interestingly, when we really write down our accomplishments, our strengths, and things we're good at, it can help shift these automatic negative thoughts and beliefs. Because no lawyer, no one on this call today, um, you know, hasn't worked incredibly hard to get to where you are. And so to be able to actually own that and acknowledge that is so important. So think about doing this, really. It's a really hard exercise for many of us because it can feel narcissistic or that like inaccurate. And your perfectionistic part might not like you doing this, but it's really helpful. And then when you receive success, not to just put it off at like, oh, I was lucky, or oh, my colleague helped me. You worked hard, right? And so talking to yourself like, I worked hard. This matters to me. And even highlighting the positives in your, emails that you get. I have a lovely staff at LCL, lovely teammates, and they really do a great job of like if there's feedback that someone shared, to share it with each other. It makes such a difference, and then not only to hear it, but also to savor it and to take it in. And, when you've taken a challenge or you've pushed yourself into the out of your comfort zone, to really recognize like, wow, this is flexibility, this is resilience, this is healthy striving, right? To recognize that risk you took. So this is an active process, and the more that we do it, the more comfortable we are, so that we're not unconsciously working from this negative bias we have toward ourselves. Of course, we want to also utilize supports, and that's why it's really important to talk with your peers. I want leaders to kind of think about, can you talk more frankly and honestly, um, vulnerably asking for feedback. The fear of this is so strong, but when we do that, it can really help us. And it also helps our ethics, right? If we're not hiding, and so often if we're hiding what we're struggling with, we're more likely to make mistakes, not ask for help, avoid, procrastinate. So that vulnerability of asking for help actually helps improve our performance and makes us less likely to have ethical violations, ethical decision avoidance, or impacting our clients negatively. Believing compliments. It's so hard, but right, taking that in. And then also, can we give back to other people so that compassion goes outward as well as inward? And then finally, we talk about this a lot. I was on a mindfulness call today with some of my colleagues from mindfulness in the law. Big shout out to them and plug to join us. But we were talking about changing the culture in law schools, and one of the lawyers who participated today shared how at her law school they have a panel every year where they talk about making mistakes and how people have learned, how lawyers have learned, whether they've struggled in school early on or whether they had early career pivots or difficulties, how that can really help. And so that's like changing the culture, recognizing mistakes and not always being perfect doesn't lead to catastrophic results. Okay, so some self-compassion practices I'd like to do today. So we're going to do this together now, right? We just have a few minutes, but I want to just take a few moments to do this. So I'm going to ask you to come up with a personal compassion phrase you can use. So here's some suggestions, and you might have your own phrase, but I want you to write down at least one phrase. It might be one from here or one that you have already. And what can you say to yourself when you are struggling with a feeling of imperfection, low self-esteem, not good enough? So take a look at one of these and see if you can find one or two or more. What would help you bring in some inner kindness? And even notice, you might even say it to yourself. And let's try that, right? Like just saying to yourself one of these phrases. And I often will put my hand on my heart. This is a little 20-second self-compassion practice. Imagine, again, you just had a difficult situation come up where you felt less than, that you screwed up, you made a mistake, right? Just placing your hand on your heart and saying one of these phrases to yourself, like, oh, okay. It's okay to feel this. May I be kind to myself. Even if it feels a little phony or fake, you are bringing in self-kindness. And the more we do this, the more that we actually start to shift the way we think about ourselves. All right, so 20 seconds, hand on the heart, self-compassion phrase. And what we can do, we can bring this together with some cognitive behavioral reframing. So when an automatic thought arises, we can say to ourselves, okay, this is a moment, or this is a thought around perfectionism, or this is making me anxious or worried. You can use your phrase. And then sometimes you can even use a reframe, right? And so instead of saying, I'm failing, like the example here, just reminding yourself, okay, this is hard. I'm doing the best I can. I'm going to ask for help, or other people struggle with this. So bring in self-compassion and then bring in a reframe. These are short steps. And what happens with our brains, I'm just going to geek out just for a second, but when we are in a regular thought pattern of perfectionism and self-blame, it's kind of a default. Our brain likes to do this, and then it will get anxious, right? So it's like this little pattern that's happening in our brain. When we step out of that, we name it, we notice the feeling, and then we bring in self-compassion. We are creating a new pattern in the brain, literally a new network in the brain. And the more we do this, neurons that fire together, wire together, we start to shift how our brain normally operates, right? So it's really helpful to repeat this, even if in the beginning it feels kind of formulaic, okay? And then, we can think about self-compassion on a more regular basis. How do we bring it both for ourselves and others? And, this is I've talked about this, in two ways. Like self-compassion can be very tender, but it also can sometimes help us with boundaries. And so sometimes when we're using a self-compassion phrase, I didn't include too many of these here, but it might even be, I'm willing to say no, or I'm ready to make a change, or I don't want to do this anymore. It doesn't feel good to me. Sometimes that's a self-compassion phrase. It can be more fierce in a way. It's like more of an active practice as well. And so sometimes we need to check in and say, do I need more comfort or more of a boundary setting, right? And so we can, really nuance how we talk to ourselves based on what we're needing in the moment. So this is a little series of questions you can ask yourself. What do I need? When I feel this way, what helps? And so I talk about the 4 N's. So this is like the noticing, naming it, asking yourself what your need is, and then what's the next small step? Maybe it's the self-compassion phrase, hand on the heart, a few breaths, or talking to somebody, getting some validation and support. So my go-to 20-second practice is hand on the heart. It can trigger a cascade of positive hormones. Oxytocin can help us pause, take a moment before we go into our automatic behavioral response to the negative thoughts, like work harder, overcompensate. So this is just this 20-second practice, self-touch with the self-compassion phrase. Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer have other practices, including the self-compassion break, which I love, which has 3 components: just acknowledging the suffering, and then again, noticing how you can care for yourself in the moment. All right, I want to save time for some questions because I know we're getting toward the end. And so thank you all for staying on the call.
So first of all, Tracy, as always, an amazing, amazing presentation. And I was taking notes and writing down all these interesting facts and what you've shared. But ultimately, what I took away, I said, oh my God, self-compassion is this extremely powerful tool. And noticing when you talked about reducing shame, stress, depression, helping you set better boundaries, all these things just struck me. So rather than going through all my notes, that was something that I just wanted to say thank you for that. And again, a great tool. I know folks are often looking for tools. So we do have some questions out there. I do want to read. So first of all, yes, we are going to send everybody the slides. I know we often get those questions. So this is excellent to see this topic emphasized in the legal space. Too often the industry is focused on productivity, but we love to see a shift to a more holistic view. Thanks for doing this. Again, somebody else, excellent program. We do have somebody who asked if you could share that Michelle Obama clip.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know, maybe we can send that along with the recording unless you have that easily accessible right now. But anyway, so that's something that folks were interested in. See, somebody else said this entire presentation was fantastic and spoke directly to my heart. Can't wait to incorporate some of these notions into my law school class.
Oh,
so
great.
again, yes, very powerful. Something that I don't want to say is easy because I don't think self-compassion is easy, but it is such a hands-on tool that we can apply. We don't need to pull in equipment. We don't need to pull in all these other things, but we can take care of it ourselves. So somebody else comments, as lawyers, we often hear what we did wrong, but not what we did right, or we give feedback that is corrective and not appreciative. Do you have advice about how to be your own cheering section if you are only hearing the jeering section?
Oh, yeah, nice. I like that. Yeah, and I think that's why it's like a regular practice. It's not something, when we get corrective feedback, it sticks, some of the negative pieces. That's why it's like that ongoing recognition of all of the positive feedback we have. Literally, sometimes writing it out and saying it to ourselves, because we only do hear. I mean, our brains are going to be wired to take in the negative, and so there's a ratio we've heard of like 4 to 1, where we need to hear 4 positives before we can actually feel okay to one negative. Like one negative thing can really stick. And so just recognizing, oh, this is normal to feel drawn toward the negative, and then also to be able to literally even come up with 3 or 4 positive things that the feedback also said. So we do have to work with our own evolutionary brain that wants to take us down the negativity rabbit hole, the jeering section.
So we do have a few more questions coming in fast and furiously.
Sure.
How can one practice self-compassion in a situation when your mistake directly affects clients, not just yourself?
Yeah. And the thing is, it's so common. It's just people don't talk about it. We hide that. And that's one of the biggest challenges, because if you ask any lawyer, especially seasoned or senior lawyer, they're going to say, I've made lots of mistakes. But because there's a shame component, it can feel like there's so much on the line and I hurt somebody else, right? So to recognize you are not alone, we do need to create a culture where we can acknowledge mistakes, because they do happen. And truly, how much can you learn from that? So I think it's also, when this mistake happens, how can I compassionately learn from this so that, that doesn't happen again? Or if it does, I'm much more empowered. So I think our culture around acknowledging mistakes is so critical to help us be able to get help from each other.
Thank you. Somebody else asked, and if folks need to go, certainly, but Tracy, if you could stay on for a few more moments. Are there any apps that you recommend for mindfulness and self-compassion?
Yeah, so the self-compassion work on Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org, she has a bunch of different practices. And you can download them. I really like hers because they are specific around self-compassion. There are, one of my favorite apps is also Insight Timer, and you can even put in self-compassion. You'll get some really lovely meditations from very, very esteemed teachers that talk about self-compassion. But Kristen Neff's website, selfcompassion.org, is an excellent resource for very specific practices like the self-compassion break that I referenced at the end. There's a self-compassion. There's one called a compassionate mess, which I love. Like, what do you do when you're overwhelmed with, too much compassion fatigue? There's lots of different ones that on her website. So that's one I'd highly recommend.
Excellent. A few more questions again for those that can stick with us. How is feeling inferior to others related to self-compassion and imposter syndrome? Is lack of self-confidence, self-esteem, feeling inferior all the same thing, or is there a differentiation to them by feelings or thoughts? And then would the strategies to overcome them be the same?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, the thoughts and beliefs are that's often the fuel for imposter syndrome, right? Feeling inferior is one of the characteristics. I don't measure up. Um, some personality styles, like we saw earlier, like for people that like don't typically struggle and then they do, can create that very quickly. For some people, it's kind of a more chronic feelings of inferiority. So it shows up a little bit differently. But yeah, absolutely, that's tied in with imposter phenomenon. And it's in different degrees, whether you've struggled, and this is what we see sometimes with law students, right, where they didn't experience a lot of that early on because they were so successful in undergrad, and as soon as that they meet some challenges, that's when it really comes out and the inferiority comes out. For others, it's been more of a lifelong struggle, maybe because of trauma background or intergenerational, the way our parents have put themselves down. So it can be a more kind of early onset of that as well.
So we have some other really big questions that I think are going to be really hard to answer in just a few moments. And we are a little bit over time. One thing I'll just mention, somebody says that perfectionism is exacerbated in law school because of mandatory curves, etc. And imperfect grades or lesser than other grades close so many doors without consideration of other factors. Do you think the entire legal model from education to practice needs an overhaul? And how can we make that happen? That's a big question.
Question. I appreciate that so much. I mean, yes, right? Exactly. I think you said it exactly right. That and even the perception that it closes the door and the reality too, right? And so I think that's why like I was so grateful to hear my colleagues at one of the law schools literally have a panel of people that didn't get good grades or good enough grades and what that meant and then their successful trajectories. We need to have models because there's always going to be, people, all of us are going to sometimes not perform at the highest level compared to our peers. And so I think we need models for that and to look at it with a lot less shame and a lot more optimism. So the answer is yes. And part of it is to have the more open conversations about it, even if people in the middle of it, aren't comfortable sharing, but people that have gotten to the other side and navigated through a personal or academic challenge and coming back and helping mentor their peers.
And we do have to go, but if there's anybody that has a question, I think you can schedule an appointment directly with Dr. Myers through our website. If again, these are more personalized questions, and our services are free, they're confidential. So all you need to do is go to our website and schedule an appointment. And again, I think there are some questions out there that it would be helpful if you talk to Tracy directly in an individual session. If you want, you can spend 10 minutes with her or the full hour and get your questions answered there. But thank you all for joining us. I can see that this was a really hot topic. So thank you again, Tracy. And we will also, I do want to mention that we have a follow-up program that's related to, it's called Beyond Fake It Till You Make It, a lawyer's guide to building real confidence. So that will happen early next month. So be sure to sign up for that one. Again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.